Well, hello and welcome to the RIBA. I'm Jack Pringle. I'm chair of the RIBA Board of Trustees, and I'm a past president of the RIBA. I'm an architect, and I've headed up Pringle Brandon, and then Perkins and Will in the EMEA, and now I am with Studio Pringle with my two eldest daughters, who order me around mercilessly, and I'm the oldest startup in town. Thank you all for joining us for this last talk in our RIBA VitrA autumn series of talks, Wellbeing, Well-Built, a program that explores how architects and designers can shape the environments and spaces we inhabit to create places that enhance our sense of well-being, both physically and mentally. This talk is part of our ongoing partnership with VitrA Bathrooms, and I would like to thank VitrA Bathrooms for sponsoring our series of talks. VitrA are working together with the RIBA to explore a wide-ranging survey of topics, projects, and innovative ideas about the ways society is rethinking the relationship between the built environment and our physical and mental health. Our environment and our spaces we inhabit influence and impact our behavior, our relationships, and how we interact with one another, as well as our emotions and sense of well-being. As architects and designers, shaping these spaces is not just about their functionality, but the details and features that enhance the environment, creating places that lift and boost our mood and improve the quality of how we connect with one another. The program has responded to topical and pressing issues through showcasing the work of architects and designers working to develop physical, digital, and societal infrastructures to engender healthier living. Topics covered have ranged from how architects can integrate a biophilic approach to create spaces that are lighter and healthier to live in. We've heard from Abe Rogers and his award-winning concept and future vision for hospitals and how these spaces can help the healing process for all who visit. We've also heard from architects who are creating spaces that are more nurturing, safe, and welcoming for those with dementia, as well as how architects and designers use color to create uplifting and environments that help us to connect with one another and the surrounding context. These previous talks can be viewed on YouTube by searching for RIBA VitrA series and the Wellbeing, Well-Built playlist. Now to tonight. A few years ago, my very good friend and the RIBA's good friend, Anne Cricken-Mann, who worked variously for SOM, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and Arup, both in New York and London, said to me, "Jack, London is such a difficult city to live in." And I said, "I know, it's so expensive." And she said, no, I don't mean that. She said, in New York, they make it easy. Every few blocks, by the way, Catherine doesn't agree with this, but we'll come back to that later. She said, in New York, every few blocks has its own neighborhood. It's got a convenience store, it's got a mom and pop restaurant for breakfast and for everyday eating, it's got a dry cleaners, a school, a doctor, a dentist. You know, everything that you need on a sort of day-to-day basis is there in a sort of radius in New York. And of course, there's a density that can support that. He says, London just doesn't work like that unless you're lucky enough to be in Marylebone Village or the one or two places that have, you know, that sort of collection of amenities. Well, I think she's right. And of course, more generally, our post-war planning policy of zoning areas into homogeneous use classes has done nothing to help the UK in this respect. In London, plenty of people have regularly commuted an hour or more each way to work and back. And of course, the collateral effect of COVID-19 has been working from home. And guess what? People like it. They don't like traveling for 2.5 hours a day. And actually, I know because it's the sort of work I do, businesses are actually finding it difficult to get people to come back to the office because they just don't want to waste so much of their life traveling. All of this plays to tonight's lecture. Excuse me. I am particularly pleased to welcome Professor Carlos Moreno, who is here to present his award-winning proposal and concept, the 15-minute city, a proposition that promotes a human-centric and environmentally sustainable urban future. Awarded with an Nobel Prize in 2021, this concept offers a radical departure to the current direction of modern urbanism, reducing the radius in which amenities and activities are situated and take place, making our cities more local, more accessible, and more livable. Restructuring urban life so that each resident could live the urban experience within a 15-minute radius would revolutionise city living. The hyperlocal global urban movement, as Moreno terms it, a bit difficult to say sometimes, would drastically reduce traffic and CO2 emissions, fundamentally increasing the health and well-being of people around the world. Professor Carlos Moreno is scientific director at IAE Paris Sorbonne University in France. He has earned recognition as a scientist with an innovative mind, pioneering works, and a unique approach on urban issues. He is also a scientific advisor of national and international figures at the highest levels. He works at the heart of issues of international significance as a result of his research, bringing a new perspective on urban issues and offering solutions to the issues faced by the cities and territories during the 21st century. Some of his concepts traveling the world: the human smart city, the 15-minute city, the territory of 30 minutes. In June 2022, he launched the Global Observatory of Proximities at the World Urban Forum, #WUF11, with UN Habitat, Centre for Cities, UCLG, and other partners. Following the presentation from Carlos Moreno, we are grateful to Catherine Firth, Director of Cities Planning and Design at Arup, who will join us to chair a conversation and navigate the topic, looking at the reality of this concept within a UK context. Catherine is an architect and urban designer whose passion for creating thriving urban places spans some 30 years, working in cities around the world with diverse spatial, social, and economic contexts. She's led master planning and urban regeneration projects across the UK and the US, Europe and the Middle East. These have ranged from public realm improvements to brownfield site developments of several thousand hectares. Prior to joining Arup, Catherine was urban design director at several practices in the UK and the US. She was the chief of design at the London Legacy Development Corporation, where she directed teams of architects, landscape architects, planners, engineers to realise the Olympic legacy. In this position, she had oversight of the production of design guidance to control quality as agreements were entered with development partners. Catherine is committed to a productive exchange between the practice of urban design and academic research, and is a proponent of multidisciplinary approach that ensures collaboration across design, development, and socio-economic disciplines. So that is our program. We will have time for questions at the end, so do think some up. And now you may, and we'll have a roaming mic for that. So please, can you welcome again Professor Carlos to come to the stage?
Thank you, Zach, for this introduction. Good evening, everyone. Apologize still now for my delay for arriving Paris, Brussels, London for today. Thank you to RIBA for this invitation as well. It's a great pleasure to share with you my advocacy for living differently today, for having a radical change in our urban and territorial lifestyle. I want to discuss during 39 minutes now on this concept, the revolution of proximities, coined as research and academic work, and today with a lot of partnerships and implementation around the world, from the concept of proximities, of happy proximities, to the different implementations. I said that the most important point for this lecture, when we want to evoke my research work, is the word proximities. A lot of people, in fact, consider that 15-minute city this great revolution. In reality, this revolution is not the number of 15. We could have 10, 15, 18, 21, 23. This is not the problem. The question is, how could we live differently today in face with climate change? How could we evoke a new urban lifestyle for having a more peaceful life? This is the situation today in our planet, 8 billion inhabitants. And unfortunately, at the same time, we have continued to increase the CO2 emissions. This is, for the first time, a great risk for all humanity. In this Anthropocene era, we need to be aware that our challenge today is how could humanity have or not the possibility for surviving before the end of this century. Surviving because in the Anthropocene era, this is at the same time the urbanized world. We live today in Europe, 76% of urban population, 80% more in Latin America, 83% in the Northern America. We live today in an urbanized world. The role of cities is today the strategic role for deciding about our next decades, if we wanted to change or not, for reducing the CO2 emissions and to reducing this risk of the global warming. It is very important in our continent, in Europe. I continue to include the UK in Europe. Because we need to be aware that in Europe, UK including, we have the most important impact in terms of increase of temperature. Twice the global average around. We have in Europe a very significant role of cities. The presence of more than 420 cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants. This is the 3D view of this urbanized continent. The essential economical activities are supported today, in general, by less than 200 cities in Europe. We need a Green Deal in our planet for fighting against global warming, for limiting the increase of temperature, not more for 1.5 degrees. This is did by to limit in the range of 1.5 until 3. This is unfortunately the results of the last COP27 in Egypt. I am convinced that we need a global Green Deal for our cities. To have a global Green Deal for our cities, it's not only to fight against the global warming. We need, at the same time, to have resilient cities, because Saskia Sassen said for a long time, the global cities are at the same time the places that unfortunately produce as well poverty and exclusion. If we wanted to reach a real climate justice, we needed to transform the economical and social relationships in our cities. We need, in fact, to develop a new ambitious roadmap for having this sustainability in cities and in territories. But sustainability, we have 3 aspects. The first one, ecological, for protecting our natural resources, for having a livable cities and territories. But we need at the same time to develop economical activities for having a viable cities, and to develop a social positive impact for developing the social inclusion. Sustainability is the convergence of the ecological, economical, and social positive impact. The 21st century is the century of this risk of the global warming. At the same time, the 21st century, the urbanized 21st century, the massively urbanized 21st century, is the century of the massive social disconnection. For the first time in the history of humanity, we have the possibility for being hyper-connected. This is the case. And unfortunately, this is the same century where we are massively socially disconnected. We need to develop more humanity. We need to develop more relationships. We need to develop more humanity. We need to fight against this new kind of people. I call them the zombie geeks. Geeks far because connected in permanence, a zombie because often disconnected, with the consequences of fake news, the individual bubbles, etc. The role of cities is a major role if we wanted to develop this convergence, ecological, economical, and social. And at the same time, is the place for regenerating the human relationships. I proposed 10 years ago, when internet was born, this concept of the human smart city, because I consider that we need to use those technologies for developing more and more economical and social inclusion in cities. This is the situation in a lot of different cities. A lot of stress, a lot of traffic jams, on human mail for shopping, the bad condition, even poor condition for the mass transportation in the peak hours, lot of constant stress. Our academic research at Sorbonne University, my scientific contribution is in fact focused in a new definition of the quality of life for living differently in face with this chaotic situation. Global warming, poverty, social exclusion, an urbanized world, a social disconnected people. And we need to consider this new definition of the quality of life, not only in cities, but in all locations. My scientific contribution, in fact, is to propose a new model, a new paradigm for finding the new ecological, economical, and social relationships, regardless of the size of the density in cities or in territories. When I say cities, this is the compact zone. When I say territories, this is the middle and low density zone. And our contribution is to consider the essential needs for satisfying in all locations this quality of life for rehumanizing cities. We consider that we have accepted the unacceptable. We have accepted, in fact, to live in a segmented, fractured zone, unequal, hectic cities. We have accepted, in fact, three bad situations. The first one, to accept the daily long commute, to spend my useful time only for 1, 2, 3 hours just for a round trip, for going from my home to my office every day. We have accepted as well to misuse building by the single functions for the majority of infrastructures and building. The rate of use of building is very, very low, less than 40%. In a lot of metropolises, a building is closed more than 60% of the time. Given that this single function for infrastructures related to the zoning. And of course, the consequences of the long commute in this misused building is the loss of social interactions, the loss of social interactions in proximity, the ghost districts, the ghost corporate districts. I am very happy today when I observe the relevance of this global movement for proximity around the world, because this is the possibility for creating a new urban and territorial narrative. And in my opinion, one of the most significant points is this new opportunity for turning the page on Le Corbusier and the Athens Charter, for turning the page of zoning. This is totally unhuman to continue to develop more and more infrastructures for going further and faster, for having long distances, for continuing to separate the social functions, to continue to consider that a city which have a success is a city with a speed and quickly. This was the vision of Le Corbusier. We are inspired by the Brussels declarations in 80s. In 1980, the Brussels declarations, this was the declaration for rebuilding the European cities based on a radical opposition to Le Corbusier zoning, with this key element mixed of uses, mixed of social categories, polycentricity, in intensive proximity. The Brussels declarations, this is a very nice, great book, said we need to develop a lot of economical and social functions for having a more useful urban life, and for having a more use of a lot of different resources in my proximity. I am totally inspired for a long time in this vision of the Brussels declarations. And 40 years after, with my team, 30 years after, I started this research 12 years ago. But we are inspired by the Brussels declarations in order to imagine a radical transformation, not of infrastructures, a radical transformation of our urban lifestyle or our territorial lifestyle. I think that it's very important to understand our vision. The question for us is not to transform infrastructures. The question for us is to transform our lifestyle, our work style, to define these new capabilities for spreading in all city a lot of different services in order to create this polycentricity in the compact zone, in the territorial zone, regardless of the size, regardless of the density. Our target, in fact, is to rehumanize cities, to find again this new capability for having livable cities, to rediscover the useful time. I think that this is one of the key elements in the post-COVID years. Everyone on time, and unfortunately, no one has time for living. The useful time is one of the significant lessons of the COVID-19. I proposed for the first time in October 2016 this model, just after the COP21 in Paris. The COP21 was a wonderful opportunity for defining with the Paris Agreement a global roadmap for reducing at the horizon 2030 at least of 50% our CO2 emissions. And just after the COP21, I said that it is not enough to have the agreement of the states for reducing with a roadmap the CO2 emission, because cities are the most significant contributor for CO2 emissions. And in cities we have two important sectors, contributors, transportation and buildings. And I proposed to reimagine another deal, another agreement, instead of to define the technical solutions for reducing the global emission of CO2, I proposed to reduce the root of these CO2 emissions, to reduce the constrained mobilities, the long commute for transportation, and to optimize the uses of buildings. I proposed 4 elements in order to develop this polycentric city, more proximities. And proximities is not only the metric distances. Proximities is at the same time the emotional proximities, the cultural proximities, the technological proximities. This is a more abstract term, including metrical proximities, but we could go beyond for developing these more emotional and technological proximities. But we need at the same time to break these social distances in cities, in particular for promoting a lot of mixities. Social mixity, and at the same time, the functional mixities. We proposed as well to develop more density, but the human density, the organic density, for having the possibility for mutualizing resources, for mutualizing services. And ubiquity, for having a real uses of digital technologies for developing more and more services. In 2016, a lot of people said, this is an idea of a researcher, but this is impossible to transform into a reality, because in all circumstances, it will be impossible to work close to home. The long commute, this is a normal situation. The normality is to have a long commute because we have the possibility to work. This is a real benefit for people, even if we need to spend 2 or 3 hours for it. Why? 6, 7 years today, this concept is very popular around the world. A lot of people said, Carlos Moreno and his team proposed a new concept. No, we are scientists. I am totally committed for developing new ideas, new concepts, but at the same time, we need to pay a tribute to different thinkers committed for reinventing our cities, from Clarence Perry at the beginning of the last century until our scientist colleagues in the Nordic countries with the time geography. But at the center of this tribute, we could find Jane Jacobs, because Jane Jacobs is as well a source of inspirations for proposing this new livability, the compact city, the new way for humanizing cities. If this concept has become popular, it's in the framework of the, I think, very particular situation. On the one hand, scientists in France for proposing a new path, but under the radar, after publishing this concept in 2016. And the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, considered in 2016 that this idea we need maybe to explore for verifying, in fact, if this is possible or not. During 2 years, maybe 3 years, 2016 until 2019, in Paris, we have explored in 3 districts the possibility for regenerating these districts with our model based on proximities. In 2019, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, considered that our explorations in these 3 different districts gave the possibility for building a new urban policy and her decision was to embrace this concept. At the end of 2019, for building her electoral campaign in 2020, for proposing to Parisians this model based on proximities. And a few weeks after, we have the COVID-19 in Europe, the constraint for with the lockdown. The mayor of Milan, Giuseppe Sala, embraced as well this concept during the pandemic period, and the C40 cities, Giuseppe Sala was the chief of the COVID-19 recovery force, considered that this new way is in fact the best way for proposing a new roadmap for cities in the convergence of climate change. This is the core of the C40 cities, the global network of cities for fighting against climate change, and to develop this convergence of a new urban lifestyle for preventing the situation in the post-pandemic period. In 2020, this concept, in fact, have spread around the world. This year, in February 2022, the Ukrainian war involved a lot of new constraints. The energy crisis, the cut of energy, the difficulty for having raw materials, inflation. And we have today, in a lot of countries in Europe, this new constraint for reducing dependencies, for developing more local employment, for using more and better the different local resources, for having more livability with more energy efficiency. In the prolongation of the COVID-19, the impact, we have at the same time the crisis of the real estate corporate. This is in 2022, the new impact for fostering the development of this proximity. We have tried a new work style to use new technologies for having digital jobs. A lot of workers, in particular between 20 years old and 40 years old, in the different surveys and different researchers consider that we need not only to transform the work style, but to reduce long commute. And this 50-minute city concept, in fact, was adopted by this category of population in the independent researchers. And recently, we could observe this new situation when we have, including for workers without the possibility for accessing to digital technologies, a lot of prefer to resign in order to find a job with more proximity instead of to spend 2 or more hours for commuting. This is the International Workplace based in London. Mark Dixon, the CEO, he said, the long commute in a few months, in a few years, will be an alien souvenir, because the 50-minute commute, it will be the new paradigm for the 21st century. This is a very important change in this year, because for the first time, we have a lot of very, very significant institutions of the private sector that decide to embrace this concept. The International Workplace, the FIAPSI, the International Federation of Real Estate. If we want to consider how could we implement this proximity, in reality, we wanted to deploy 3 convergent axes for the concrete implementation, for the concrete actions. The first one, to change the rhythm of the city, the chrono-urbanismo. Instead of to have the daily routines from my home to my office, 1 or more hours, 2 or 3 hours for a round trip, to develop the new economic models, including with the private sector. For us, it was a very, very, very good news when the International Workplace called me for discussing Carlos Moreno. We could propose the new paradigm for working. The name is the spoken hub, the decentralized working, to consider the possibility for developing this desaturation, for having this decentralized site, instead of to go every day to my traditional corporate building, the possibility to go for several hours, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, to the decentralized places for working, and to reduce the presence in the corporate district, the headquarters, only when it is absolutely necessary. The second point is the chronotopia, to develop these massive multi-purpose functions. We have today lot of examples around the world, very nice examples for transforming the economic model, for using the building, the infrastructure that exists today, to transform a disco open only during a few hours during the weekend in the sport rooms in the afternoon, to transform in cafe, to transform a restaurant, to transform the infrastructure, the exhibition center, stadium, to open the schools during the weekend, to develop these multi-purpose activities for having a more larger ranges for using. And at the same time, this is the possibility for the public local governance for using better and more the infrastructure that exists today in municipalities, and for the private sector for generating a new business model based on this mixity in the multi-purpose functions. And the third point, the topophilia, this is how could we generate a new urban culture for transforming our mindset, for shifting towards a new urban and territorial lifestyles. In France, for example, more than 50% of the commute in a car, in a diesel car alone, is just for a short distance, less than 5 kilometers. 5 kilometers, we need a car for that. We need to be just alone with a diesel car. This is unhuman. We need to transform our mindset, and for that we need to develop more pedagogical, educational activities. You need to propose different uses of the public space to reduce the place of the diesel car, to reuse the infrastructures of the public space for having more and more citizen activities. In fact, with the 50-minute city, we have today a very strong contributions in this new European humanistic urban life, based in the complementarity with the Green Deal. The name for cities is the New European Boroughs. And I propose to add to the New European Boroughs these keywords: intensive proximity. James Jacobs said, a livable city is a city when anytime and anywhere I have the possibility to choose, without spend my useful time and without to take a car. This is, in fact, the core of the 50-minute city of the happy proximities, to have the possibility anywhere, anytime, to have a choice. Our scientific contribution, in fact, is in a nutshell in this picture. We have developed a new model for explaining how could we find or refine the quality of life in a city or in a territory. And our model is based on these 6 essential urban functions. Each one has a color. To live in the good condition, the organic density, mutualizations, social mixity. To work without a long commute. To supply for developing local jobs, local commerce, local shops, local activities. To take care with my mental and physical health. In proximities as well. With the COVID, we could observe the importance of having this care, the proximity care. To learn, to access to education, culture, entertainment, and to enjoy in the public space with the vegetalization, resilient in face with climate change, without air and water polluted. Each one of the 6 social functions has a color. When we have explored a lot of cities around the world, the observation is very, very clear. If we want to consider the presence of the functions, we have a lot of color totally separated by the long distances. Work here, residential areas here, health points here. This is totally separated. We could visualize perfectly this fragmentation, this segregation, this zoning of cities. Our model is based on this idea that we could develop the rainbow of the social functions. A 50-minute city or a 30-minute territory is a city in a compact zone or a territory for the middle and low density when we could find this mix of the color, because we have, in this case, an accessibility within a short perimeter, on foot or by bike in the compact zone, or using electrical cars, on-demand transport, collective transport in the middle and low density. This is our scientific contribution based on the social circularity. This is the success of our concept. This is the core, realm of this human-oriented urbanism. The name of that, this is the high-quality societal life. And we have the possibility to explore the intersections between each one of the different functions. And the secret, the success of the 50-minute city or the 30-minute territory is based on our capability for combining at least 3 of the 6 social functions. If you have the possibility for combining 3 of the 6 or more, we have a city or a territory optimized in offering a new quality of life. And we could measure this new quality of life based on 3 new indicators. The indicators of my well-being, my personal well-being with my family. The second one, that my sociability with my neighbor, with my colleague, with my work colleagues. And the third one, my daily ecology, my sustainability, and my otherness with the people. The target of the 50-minute city or the 30-minute territory is to generate a lot of intersections. This is the magic process when we have decided to implement this model, because we could explore my city to identify the functions, the services, the uses, the infrastructures, and to regenerate a new process for reusing, for transforming, not for building more and more so far, but to transform the infrastructures, a building that existed today. It's for that we have a lot of awards, and the UN Habitat with the Scroll of Honor consider that the 50-minute city, the 30-minute territory, has become today a global movement. Because we could explain in a few minutes, in 3 hours, we could explain the totality of the model to different mayors, the right, of left, center, the very big cities, metropolis as Buenos Aires, a very, very small rurality, because the concept is based in how could we transform a daily life? How could we offer more services for my social housing, to avoid the long commute, to have local commerce, to implement more health services, to access to more education, entertainment, to enjoy in the public space. And we have the possibility for transforming my hectic and segmented city or territory in a more urban and territorial proximity, with the possibility for transforming our urban life in a roadmap, in a trajectory. This is not a magic wand. I said to different mayors, we don't have the possibility for saying in 3 months we could transform your city in a 50-minute city. No, this is just a trajectory. This is a framework. This is not a doxa. We don't have the receipt. You have a transformation on our mindset for developing this travel, this path from a concept to a reality. And we have in all continents, in Bogota, Barcelona, Buenos Aires, Seoul, in Africa, a lot of different cities that have decided to implement. For finishing, the digital technologies are a very powerful ally. We have developed with my team at Sorbonne University for 6 years a very powerful digital platform for exploring how could we match the 6 urban or territorial social functions with the users in the daily routines of each one of us. This is very impressive results when you could observe what is the real situation in different cities, including in a city as Paris. We have today a lot of possibilities for continuing to implement. We need to transform the local governance. We need to implement more hyperlocal services. This is not a question of infrastructure. This is not a question of mobilities. Of course, I am very, very happy when I find a lot of mayors in order to reduce the presence of diesel cars and to transform into mobilities on foot or by bike. But the question is not a question of the infrastructures. This is the engineering response. The real question is to transform the users. With the 50-minute city, we consider, for example, that the local commerce is a common good. If we wanted to fight against gentrification, we need to develop a common good in the territory, and for that, we need to transform, for example, our vision of the local commerce. This is not a question only of how could we implant my commerce. We need to implant a lot of commerce in the city. And for that, we need to create, for example, the commercial property of cities for installing people, for launching a commerce with a rent below the rent of the speculative real market. This is the case of the city of Paris. We have a lot of different locations in Paris, bakeries, libraries, recycling points, because we have decided to install with a commercial property of the city of Paris. We have launched a lot of different cities and contexts for transforming the different streets, squares, places. This is the sense of this transformation of the urban culture. We have implemented the participatory budget. We have decided to transform the uses of the district, the corporate building, for developing this mixity. I have a lot of examples around the world, but 45 minutes is reaching now. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you.
Thank you very much. That was incredibly inspiring. And what I want to do in the next couple of, or a few minutes, I don't want to take up too much time because I'm sure people in the audience have lots of questions as well, but I want to understand, because I think in a way, probably everybody in this room is excited about a 15-minute city. Nobody likes long commutes. We all care about saving the planet. So I think that, we can probably accept that. If anybody doesn't agree, you can get up and leave now. But I guess I'd like to interrogate a little bit more about how we go from the concept to the reality. So, especially for someone like me who's an urban designer, every day I'm trying to find ways to implement what you've shown. So maybe you can give me some clues. One of the questions I have, and maybe this gets a little bit into a bit more of a discussion about the territorial, the 30-minute territorial. I think it's quite easy for us to get our heads around the sort of very localized activities and our daily needs being within a 5, 10, 15-minute walk or cycle ride. But when we get into the situation where we have large institutions like hospitals, universities, factories, not every kind of enclave can have those uses, and yet people need to work in those, the nurses, the doctors, the professors. So how do we address that, other than having incredibly good public transport? Do we need to intensify around those institutions so that they become that and somehow almost go back to what was like a company town where the housing for the nurses is adjacent to the hospital? What are the answers for that? How do we get there?
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. We have today the first experiences with the very big implementations. I want maybe to share several of that. Bogota, for example, the capital of Colombia, the mayor, Claudia Lopez, has decided to implement the 50-minute city concept. Bogota is a city with 7 million of inhabitants, with the hypercenter, the very higher density, but we have 100 kilometers with a very low density. In the same metropolises, we have the coexistence of the hyperdensity, the compact zone, and rurality, with a very different economy, the rural economy until the very hectic service economy. And the decision of the Mayor Lopez was to change the urbanism, we could say in English, the territorial urbanistic plan for decomposing this territory with 32 new centralities, and to identify the different resources with this exploration, for example, health, and to develop a roadmap, in the case of the care, for decentralizing. We have in Bogota a lot of very, very modern hospitals with the very, very significant skills in the doctors, nurses, etc. But in the hypercenter, this is not the case 100 kilometers in the rurality. And for that, this is not possible to transform into a few weeks. We need to define a new program for developing, for example, more decentralized educational activities for training nurses, for being attractive for doctors, for implementing new medical centers. And this is the same situation for a lot of different activities, the case for cultural activities. We have in the hypercenter museum, cinema. We need to decentralize. I think that the lesson 2 years after the implementation of this concept, three keywords for me. Desaturation, for fighting against the peaks of long commute. Decentralization, for each one of social functions to spread in the different point of the territory. And the third one, mutualization. We need to mutualize resources. For example, in a district, we have the possibility for using the cultural center of the more close district instead of to have two different cultural centers in this proximity. We need to develop a better, I think, organization based in a most important territoriality. This is the case in Buenos Aires as well. And in France, we have today a very good experience with just a small territory, 15 square kilometers, 4,000 inhabitants. The mayor has decided to implement the 50-minute city in this point. But he said to me, Carlos, my idea is not to implement the 50-minute city for 15 square kilometers and 4,000 people, because we have a lot of different small ruralities, small towns, for just 20, 30, 40 kilometers. And the idea is to develop this new concertation, coordination, for having this grid territory. A grid territory we could have, for example, with a swimming pool here, a museum here, a theater here, a cinema, and we have the possibility for mutualize in this territory.
Thank you. I mean, I think that leads into my other question quite well, and probably have a little bit of my North American hat on when I ask this. You know, you cited the new urbanists who have, you know, some time ago now, several decades ago, being very focused in a way that we didn't talk as much about the climate crisis, but it was very much about people leaving their cars and privileging walking and cycling. But nonetheless, you know, we still across North America and also in this country have these areas of incredible low density, single family homes, maybe semi-detached. And so how do we deal with that? I mean, this is something, the retrofit of suburban, what we would call suburban or peri-urban areas, where you cannot actually walk those distances or cycle those distances easily. It's one thing to put roads on diets and, you know, turn those into green fingers. We can imagine that. But as soon as you get into people's sort of private property, how do we deal with this? Is this just a big, we have to have a quite heavy hand and it's a top down and we wait for those buildings to kind of disintegrate and then we come in and we build at a higher density? How do we address that issue in those kinds of...
You're totally right, Katrina. I have discussed with my American colleagues for a long time, in particular, Los Angeles, for example. This is a very dramatic situation. My friend Richard Sennett said long distances are a vice, and the car is an addiction. This is the new addiction of the modern times. But at the same time, in the sprawl cities, in the sprawl territory as Los Angeles, with this low density, for fighting against the use, for example, of a car, is very complicated in the mindset of people because this urban lifestyle is based on my home, my car, and my long distances with my car. I think that we need to, it's very complicated for implementing this concept, for example, in the suburbs of Los Angeles, because we don't have the possibility to propose just for working. We need to use a car for 1 hour or more. I'm very disappointed when I discuss with my colleagues in the sprawling American cities. I have the possibility, for example, to transform cities as Portland, Seattle, of course in New York. We have today a very interesting work group for that. In the American sprawl zone, I think that the transformation, a radical transformation is, to be honest, very, very difficult for the next times. Yeah, I don't have a real answer for this kind of real estate business model. We need to transform the model of the real estate, but the real estate model of the suburbs in America, this is the case in Canada, is based on these long distances for giving this idea that we could be free just with my family in my home, separated of a lot of different activities.
Well, let's not give up. I mean, I do think, what is interesting to see, and there's an entire website called Dead Malls, so dead shopping centers.
Yes.
And so things are starting to change, and they are transforming slowly. And I think what's interesting, and I think it's interesting in the context of your work, is how catalytic, in a funny way, COVID has been.
Yes.
This, what we would call a silver lining. And I guess what I wonder, given that we had Jane Jacobs and the many other great thinkers put forward similar ideas, to the new urbanists, which really it's not new urbanism, it was old urbanism. Is it going to stick this time? Like, do you think we're finally coming to our senses, and maybe because of the climate crisis being that it's a kind of magic mix now? We even have Brexit to throw in here, so we have to be more local about what we grow. So.
We need to change that. We need to change this unsustainable lifestyle. This is not possible to continue to live just in my home or in my suburbs. This is the condominium in a lot of circumstances. At the same time, I'm studying the territorial distribution in the case of the United States, because in fact we have a very significant contrast in the side east or west with the high density of from the north of Canada until the EV zone, in fact. Today, I am focusing for examining the transformation of the compact cities until 100 kilometers for developing these decentralized activities. In the suburbs, in my opinion, the big problem is the jobs. But with the COVID-19, we have more and more people for working at home, for developing more local activities. In the United States, we have a problem with the educational activities, because in general, the educational activities are private. And the educational activities for kids, for teenagers, are generators of the long commute.
Sure.
1 hour, 2 hours, just for going to a school. This is not the case, for example, in Europe, because we have a lot of schools distributed in a lot of locations in the city. In the USA, this is one other big problem. We have the buses for going to the school, even at 6 a.m. The kids, we need to put it in the buses for going during 1 hour to the school. And this is a very important challenge for reducing the distances, just for having a more reduced access to education.
Well, let's bring it back to this side of the pond then. And you spoke about this, and you've spoken about it again, that people are working from home, and you showed an image of a kind of business district, which is now not full. And we have the same thing here, you know, so while, and Jack's right, I don't agree entirely, I think that the sort of tenet that London is a city of villages is quite true, and so you do have a very sort of, and those villages did quite well during the pandemic, but what didn't do well was what we call the city of London, so the central business district. Now, the likes of Lord Foster have said we can just turn it all into housing, but actually it's not so easy, because a contemporary office building does not necessarily lend itself to becoming housing. So what do we do? I mean, right now there are about, 3,000 people living there, and it could support so many more. As you said, it's only 40% of the day that, or 40% of the space that's used, and only part of the day. How can we retrofit a business district?
I have optimistic today as far as the incorporated district are concerned, because the owner, the big firms, the big companies that manage a lot of corporate towers, corporate districts, are totally interested today in transform this economic model in order to go for this decentralizing work style. I have discussed, we have launched the international work group with different private actors for examining the future of this corporate district. And we have a start for finding new ideas. I think that the owners of the corporate towers today are totally involved for proposing a transformation of the business model. We have a lot of ways. The first one to develop more mixity, the functional mixity in the different towers, because I think that in London today the occupancy is reduced in 18% in the normal period. This is an unsustainable economic model for the next times. I think that we need to open the kind of uses. I discussed in Paris, for example, with the owner of the one more important new towers, and one level will be transformed in a few weeks, in a few months maybe, in a bigger sport room, for example, for the district, for generating a new economic model. Another will reflect for transforming the architecture of different levels for creating a kind of public space to to open. The question is the accessibility for this kind of district, because we have the elevator, the security condition. But with the technology today, it is possible to generate the accessibility with this level or not for this level. And I think that we will assist in the next months, in the next years, to intensive brainstorm based on the new economic model, the new uses for implementing. In France, in Paris in particular, I am totally involved in that, and this is very, very interesting. I was surprised by the intensity of the reflections of the private sector, of the owners of the district.
No, I think you're right, that they are catching on. I was at Canary Wharf as part of a panel. You should have been with me, because I was asked by Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, what should we do? What this district? I mean, the whole district is not very mixed, and then they went and put all the retail underground, so that didn't help. But you raised the issue of technology, and I think you've spoken in the past about sustainable digital city. And I guess I wonder, I mean, you showed us the geeks, the zombie geek, but I'm wondering if you see a positive side at all to the role of technology in achieving this.
I am optimistic in this way, because I consider that with today, the digital technologies, artificial intelligence and other, we could mix, in particular for transforming this kind of corporates. I discussed, for example, this is the case in my university. I am a professor at Sorbonne University, and for a long time, we have deployed the university campus with the long distances for going from my campus to the city center. And today we have the inverse movement. And for example, we could discuss, we have today a lot of discussions for implementing in the former corporate districts different level for hosting places for students, for our university, for developing this new mixity. When you have the possibility to mix, for example, in a tower, several levels for a student, automatically we will transform the environment, because the students we need to lunch, to the drink, to have a coffee, to go to cinema, theater, etc. I think that we could have the new possibilities, and this is concretely the case with my team at Sorbonne. We have decided to go at the center of the city of Paris in a tower for implementing this transformation, and this is today, this is totally, this is a new way, and we need to convince our students, for instead of to have our former campus so far of the center, historical center of the city of Paris, to accept to go in a tower.
But they're more likely to get a job, because they'll be next to the employers. I want to open it up to the floor now. Yes, you in the front here.
So my question is, I think these are great ideas. Now we're in a specific time frame that we need to implement radically and immediately. So my question is, one approach is kind of a more top-down, governmental, corporate approach. I think at the moment, the way things are leading, it seems that's too slow. So I'm wondering from like, I guess more people up grassroots approach, that we know our communities to some degree, and it's like, how do we start implementing such radical ideas as quickly as possible? And what would that look like?
Okay. The second question maybe at the same time?
Sure, why don't you go ahead now? We're going to take a couple of questions at a time.
Yeah.
So hi, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, would you say that some aspects of this concept and its solutions are somehow already implemented in existing cities or urban environments that are, say, historical, vernacular, and etc., but are not in Europe? And if so, is it that your research and inspiration for your solutions are purposely Eurocentric or tied to Western realities more, which is perfectly fine, but yeah, just...
Okay, thank you.
You want to go for those two? Maybe what she's asking solves what he's asking.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your question. In a nutshell, for both questions, the first one, our focus with my team for a long time, for 12 years, we have decided to reflect, to think in a new paradigm related to climate change, poverty and exclusions. And we have proposed these happy proximities, new polycentrism in cities and in territories, this model of social circularity, for implementing the new urban and territorial policy. Our intellectual production is, until now, oriented to the public sector, to the local governance, mayors, president of metropolises, governors, because we need to, we are convinced that it is necessary to preserve, in particular, the common goods, if we wanted to fight against gentrification, if we wanted to preserve a way for developing more equity, and the implementation and the discussion of the 50-minute city model, of the 30-minute territory model today, is totally linked with the local governance. If we have the possibility to have mayors decided to embrace this concept, the most strategic point is to build with them a roadmap for several years during the mandature of the governance. We consider that this is our key role to discuss with the local governance for transforming urban policy and a urban policy based on this polycentricity. For this reason, we have the strong relations with the mayors, with the C40 cities, with the UCLG, the different international organization of mayors. Today, we have a new global movement of the private sector for taking part in this movement. And in this new step, we want to create the conditions for mixing the local, the public governance with a new deal with the private sector, in particular for creating new balance in the uses of the private building, of the employment in the city. We have decided to launch, for example, the Global Observatory of Proximities. This is a point of the convergence between the public governance and the private sector. A lot of people consider that we could have a Eurocentric vision because the high quality of life is more implemented with this model in Europe. But in reality, I was born in Colombia, in South America, and I went to a lot of several activities in Asia and in Latin America. And this is very interesting, the contrast, because when, for example, I went to Argentina in a lot of moments, not only in Buenos Aires, but in the slums, in the poor districts, in the rurality with the very bad conditions for living. And one of the impacts of this concept is the new possibilities for poor people, for example, in the slum. When I present in the meetings with the different associations, the citizens in this district said to me, we don't have a good, we don't have the social housing, for example. We don't have schools. We don't have medical services. We don't have the local commerce. We don't have the local jobs. We want the 50-minute city because this is the possibility for requesting for that. The only, our conditions for living are very, very bad. We have just fragile homes without employment, without health services, without educational services. And I have assisted to the meetings or demonstration for using the 50-minute city concept of the 33 for requesting for more local medical services, more local educational activities, for transforming public spaces, for having more sport and open door, open air activities, etc. I think that we could do a balance. This is the case as well in India, for example. I have a lot of activities with the young urbanists. But this is not the local governor, this is the local mayors. This is just citizens involved to take this concept for requesting, for fighting against inequity, for fighting against the poor condition for living. I think that we could find the two sides of the same concept. The local governance with the alliances with the private sector. On the other hand, the movement of citizens for requesting for a better quality of life, or better local services.
Do we have time for one more? We're getting booted out. We don't have time for one more question. Okay, I'm being told we don't. I'm so sorry. But thank you very much. I want to invite you to join me in thanking Professor
Catherine, for
Moreno
this
for a very good
dialogue.
conversation.
Thank you.